The phrase women are not small men has gained a lot of traction online over the past handful of years or so. And that phrase usually comes packaged with the claim that women have different physiology to men. And because of that, their exercise and nutrition should be designed uniquely during both the pre and the post menopause periods. Do you agree with this sentiment?
So I think this is sort of a take on children are not small adults, which is a phrase that's been used by pediatricians for a really long time, and that they're, advocating for care that is specific to children because organ size is different and communication styles are different and pharmacology is different. So I think that's a clear example of how we need that distinction. I think it's less so when we look at exercise adaptations, how we gain muscle, how we lose fat, how we build strength, how we develop speed and power. I think initially, there are plenty of reasonable hypotheses to say there could be a sex difference here. But the more research that comes out, either replicating a study that was initially conducted in men in women, or doing kind of combined sex samples, we're seeing less and less sex differences.
Would you agree with the idea that's also thrown out quite a lot when this is being spoken about and this conversation is being had, that much of sports science and nutrition research has been done on men and simply applied to women, and that could be problematic?
I think you could make the argument that this was once very true, but it's increasingly less true. And we also need to think about what is the outcome that we're interested in. So if we think about endurance exercise, there was quite a lot of data in women prior to more female data in resistance exercise. And part of that is increased interest in strength training for women. Part of that is typically the exercise scientists who are women have focused on endurance exercise and not resistance training. But traditionally, yes, if we look even 15 years ago, let's say, we had a lot of the kind of practical training variable type studies coming out. Is frequency important? Is volume important? Is rest periods important? And those were traditionally all done in kind of college age men. And so it's not wrong for people to say that, but it does ignore all of the progress that we've made since.
So just to kind of take a step back to make sure all of the listeners are on board with what we're talking about here, there's this idea that because of differences in hormones and hormonal fluctuations, because of potential differences in muscle fiber type, and maybe that will be something we speak about, because of potential differences in stress hormone responses, that exercise prescription and nutrition prescription may need to look different for women in order to get optimal training adaptations, to promote recovery, etc. But what you're saying is that while that is a hypothesis that could make sense, that there is data has come out that leads you to believe that these sex differences are not as important as maybe others are kind of alluding to in current conversations online.
Yeah, and to be clear, some of these hypotheses were not as extreme as women need drastically different programming. It was more like, hey, do you think maybe women recover more quickly and therefore could they train more frequently on average? It's questions like that. So these are more subtle nuances, whereas the conversation online is very much, you're a woman, and so the whole script flips.
Could you clarify the way in which you evaluate the research to come to your kind of views here and recommendations, the way that you treat, say, mechanistic data versus outcome data? Because at least from my understanding, when I look at the different sides of this conversation, this specific point, the way that data is being reviewed and used to make recommendations, seems to kind of get to the crux of the differences.
Yeah, so all of this is important in the overall scientific process. So sometimes we have hypotheses that are generated from rodent models. That happens all the time. But often those rodent findings don't pan out when we actually test them in humans. And that's because rodent physiology and metabolism are different. The human system is more dynamic and complex. And so, you change one thing and there's a whole downstream of additional changes. So I think I'm not dismissive of rodent data or cell culture or anything that tries to drill down a mechanism. That's really interesting from a scientific perspective. But from a practical perspective, if we are going to give people advice about how to eat and how to exercise, then we need to actually look at the studies that tested the outcome of interest. So if I'm going to say, in order to gain muscle, then do this, or if you do this, you will lose muscle, then I need to look at a study that actually implemented that intervention and measured that outcome of interest in humans.
Can you give us an example of where you believe sort of mechanistic data is being used to overstate perhaps the benefits of something or some type of sex-specific individualization program that you believe conflicts with outcome data?
Yes. When we look at rodent data, when you remove the ovaries from the rodent and you shut down hormone production, this is a very extreme. This isn't menopause because menopause is gradual over time. So this is a kind of drastic on-off. When you do that, there looks like there's an issue with the rodent's ability to maintain muscle mass. It also looks like the satellite cell or muscle stem cell pool is kind of down-regulated. And so there's theories that maybe there are estrogen receptors on these satellite cells. And so if you are down-regulating these hormones, then somehow it's affecting muscle. And this was reversed when you injected the rodent with a synthetic estradiol. So that is an interesting hypothesis that there's some interplay here between estrogen and perhaps other ovarian hormones and skeletal muscle. So this is kind of the kernel of truth that has exploded into cycle syncing or estrogen-based therapy to attenuate muscle loss in the menopause transition. So if I can just sort of wrap up my previous point, because I presented the rodent, and so I want to mention the human. So I presented that model and that hypothesis that there's this interplay. But then we see that during the menopause transition, muscle isn't declining. Muscle declines with age, not with menopause. And people who are on an estrogen-based therapy compared to people who are not, there are no differences there in rate of muscle loss or attenuating that muscle loss. So that's just a kind of clear example here of something that sounds like a really interesting hypothesis and was found in rodents, but then it didn't really translate the way one would hope it might in human women. So as far as my perspective on how we should be giving training advice, I think, of course, training needs to be individualized. I think any coach who's worked with real people would agree with that, because you have people coming to you with different backgrounds and different skill sets and different goals and different injury history. And you have to take all of that into account to design a program for somebody that is going to be appropriate and sustainable and challenging enough. And then you adapt over time. So if I were to sit down and have a conversation with someone, the fact that they are a man or a woman would not be in the first 20 questions I probably thought about when in trying to have this conversation about what would be an appropriate diet or training program for them.
What do you think could be the potential downsides of sex-specific training and nutrition messaging? Because I think a lot of people see the conversation online and it seems to be promoting women to lift more weights, to doing more cardio, things that generally I think most people would agree are pretty health promoting. Is there any form of harm that you think could be downstream of this sex-specific training kind of messaging?
Yes, because it overcomplicates everything. It says you are a woman and therefore, you must focus on the nutrient timing nuances pre and post workout. You are a woman and you've turned 40, and so you should no longer train in moderate or higher rep ranges. You need to do these high load, low reps. You are a perimenopausal woman. You should no longer do any zone 2 training. You only need to be sprinting. So we're starting to create all these rules and barriers that actually end up discouraging people from doing the training that they enjoy, which is a terrible outcome, and or not exercising because of the fear around the fact that they're doing something wrong, or they want to exercise at 4:30 in the morning, but they don't have time to eat beforehand. So it just inserts all of these levels of complication. And in some cases, it completely misleads people. Walking with a weighted vest is a perfect example of that. There are plenty of women now who think walking with a weighted vest is going to build muscle and increase bone mineral density. And the data does not support that at all. So in that case, you have people who are engaging in an activity that isn't harmful. All physical activity is good, but they think it is going to gain them this benefit that really isn't an evidence-based recommendation.
Right. And does it pose as a distraction from things that might matter more?
When we know the things that are good for muscle and bone.
So how much of those things that you kind of just walked through would you say we actually have outcome evidence, right? So, because I think one thing that comes up here is people naturally say, okay, well, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. And, we maybe, yes, sure, we only have these mechanisms, but it suggests that there are differences between men and women. And because we don't have perfect outcome data, it makes sense, now to at least be hypothesizing that there is this difference between men and women and perhaps acting on it if it's not a behavior that is harmful or doesn't have a lot of downside. Are these all things that we've tested at an outcome level? Zone 2 training, for example, which you mentioned, and different types of training during the menstrual cycle?
They are. So when we look at protein metabolism in the skeletal muscle at rest and during exercise in men versus women, very similar. They increase during exercise, which is exactly what we would expect, but there isn't a difference. The quote unquote anabolic window, or that window of sensitivity post training, is quite large. It stays elevated for at least 24 hours, and that's true in men and in women. When we think about how we adapt to both aerobic and resistance exercise, we have a wealth of data on younger men, younger women, older men, older women, and everything in between. And the recommendations are very similar. They should be very similar, although there are some sex-based differences that we might observe at baseline in untrained people. Once we start exercising, we adapt in a training-specific manner. And so then those baseline sex differences start to disappear. I think we're in an era of the wearables where it's starting to take away our agency. And so we're saying, well, let me look at the app to tell me how I slept, and therefore to tell me whether I should train hard today or not. And sometimes that data is interesting, but if we aren't able to have that autonomy to say, I feel like training hard today, I think that's important.
Have you guys ever tried creatine gummies? I have. And in fact, for a while there between you and I, they were a secret vice of mine. Damn, they tasted good. Problem was, like many creatine gummy brands, while they taste good, they contain very little, if any, creatine at all. A lot of brands that have been selling these creatine gummies over the years have been knowingly or unknowingly duping us. So I've been waiting for a brand to bring out creatine chews that are actually legit. And Momentous stepped up to the plate big time. The all new Momentous creatine chews deliver exactly 1 gram of CreaPure creatine monohydrate, which is the gold standard form, single sourced from Germany and NSF certified for sport, meaning that every single batch is independently tested for purity, for safety, and for label accuracy. There's no artificial sweeteners, no fillers, just science-backed, clinically proven performance in a portable, craveable format. And right now, Momentous is offering our listeners up to 35% off your first order with promo code THEPROOF. Go to livemomentous.com and use promo code THEPROOF for up to 35% off your first order. That's livemomentous.com, promo code THEPROOF. Why do you think sex-specific training, sex-specific fueling kind of programs has caught fire?
I think it is packaged in a way that's very marketable because it says you have been sold all of this male training and now I see you. And as a woman, I have the secret to really empower you and we're going to do things that are appropriate for you. And regardless of whether there's any truth, it's a message that resonates with people because you want to feel like your program is as tailored to you as it could possibly be. It's kind of funny. I see it more and more online lately. There will be these coaches on social media that will say, helping Christian dads lose fat, or helping redheads gain muscle. And of course, the principles are exactly the same, but it's giving you a kind of sense of community, I guess, and people are attracted to that.
Yeah, we're attracted to feeling understood and being seen, like you said. And this definitely, it feeds into that. But the question is it necessary and is there data to support it? Or are we focusing on the wrong thing and, as you said earlier, potentially complicating things for women?
I think it's also very marketable, and we can't ignore that piece of it because that's true across the board in fitness. If you say things that are a little bit more controversial or that tell people you have this secret that no one else knows, then you're more likely to sell programs or sell books or sell tickets to an event or whatever the thing is. People want to think that there's a kind of secret sauce and other people don't know. So the fact that you have this information makes it worth spending money on what you're selling.
I saw in your recent conversation you had with Spencer Nadolsky and Dr. Stacey Sims that when menstrual cycle training came up, Dr. Sims actually kind of walked back, I guess, her position there and communicated that, at least based on more recent data, she no longer supports this idea of adjusting training through the menstrual cycle. Did that surprise you to hear from her, someone that, to my understanding, really put that on the map?
It did surprise me. I was glad that she acknowledged there's newer data. Unfortunately, she's yet to say that on her platform publicly, which I wish she would. The unfortunate kind of effect of this is, in my mind, if there's no difference, if we don't need to worry about these nuances, it actually opens up all of these opportunities for more research in women. And that's kind of a step too far for her. She says, well, no, we still absolutely need to control for all of these things, account for all of these things. And it's a real barrier for labs that are smaller with fewer resources to say, in addition to doing everything that goes into conducting this study, you also need to recruit women who have a similar length menstrual cycle, and you need to do blood work throughout, and you need to standardize all of your testing or training at a specific time point. If we don't have to do any of that, and I think there's good enough evidence at this point to say we probably don't, then that unlocks the potential for more combined sex samples, more combined women on and off an hormonal contraceptive. So it bothers me that we're going to say maybe it doesn't matter, but we absolutely still need to be worrying about it in a research setting because that it really keeps us kind of stuck.
I believe you actually researched menstrual cycle training adaptations, right?
I did.
Yeah. Maybe share that with us. What was your hypothesis going into that? What did you look at and what did you find in that work?
So if we go back to that rodent model that I mentioned earlier, the take home from that probably prematurely, was that there's something quote unquote anabolic about estrogen. And so then the hypothesis was, well, if estrogen is anabolic, then when we look at menstrual cycle hormone fluctuations, then is that high estradiol phase, or it's really a handful of days, but is there something about that that might be better for our muscle adaptations? Can we capitalize on this? And on the flip side, is there something about progesterone that is catabolic, and therefore we shouldn't be pushing our resistance training really hard? So that's sort of the idea. And there was some earlier work that assessed this, but unfortunately, they just kind of assumed that everybody has a 28-day cycle on average, and everyone ovulates roughly in the middle, meaning you have two equal length phases, follicular and luteal, or pre-ovulatory, post-ovulatory, and they never measured hormones. So these were really low quality studies because they made a ton of assumptions. And having done this work and tracked ovulation in many women over many cycles and measured hormones in many women over many cycles, there's so much variability in the length of the cycle. We can have 21-day cycles, like from period to period, or 35-day cycles, and those can be normal for that person. And the timing and the magnitude of the hormone fluctuations and timing of ovulation, it's so variable. So when you just assume, then you miss all of that variability.
So if it is so highly variable and therefore you can't give a blanket recommendation, like, during that follicular phase up until ovulation, go hard, your body's really resilient to stress, do lots of strength training and do lots of HIIT. And then in that post-ovulation period, dial down the high intensity work, do more zone 2, rest and recover. Like that's some of the rhetoric that I've heard that's out there. What I'm hearing is, well, look, we can't give a blanket advice to women to do that. And there's a lot of variability in their own menstrual cycle. Is there a way at the individual level for a woman to adjust their training, whether it's based on their menstrual cycle or based on other markers like HRV, resting heart rate, subjective feelings? Like how would you recommend a woman approaches that?
So the work that I did compared a woman to herself, meaning we're going to look at that high estradiol week before ovulation and assess muscle protein synthesis at rest and during exercise over that week-long period. So we use metabolic tracers to kind of capture that integrated muscle protein synthesis and breakdown. And then we repeated that in the mid-luteal phase where the progesterone is high and estradiol is kind of having a secondary moderate peak. And so this was very tightly controlled such that we could capture all of these windows in these individual people, even though they were different from each other. That was irrelevant because of the nature of the study design. And there were no differences in how the muscle actually responded to resistance exercise, looking at the muscle analysis in the highest quality that we have. So we're taking biopsies and we are actually measuring incorporation of a tracer and the rate of that incorporation. And that's how we would calculate muscle protein synthesis. And just to kind of put a button on that, we actually tested this in these different hormone profiles and there still was no difference. So I think even if we could say, oh, well, if there were a difference, but it's so variable, you don't even know what phase you're in, that would be one conversation. But the conversation we're having is we tested it and there was no difference. So I don't think we should even continue to be trying to overhaul our training every week of the cycle. There's no physiological rationale for it.
So that study looked at muscle protein synthesis. Do you or your lab or any other labs, have they taken that further and looked at muscle mass and strength, like harder outcomes?
In terms of acute strength or muscle mass over time?
Over time.
That study is underway, so it will come. But also, when you think about the variability that I mentioned, realize how incredibly complex that is to carry out. Because if you have somebody who has a follicular phase of 9 days and a luteal phase of 22 days, what do you do with that? or vice versa, right? So if you have two 14-day phases, then it's easy to say, okay, I'm going to adjust my frequency, or this is how I'm going to train. I'm going to do this type of training, however you want to frame it. But when you start to have these very unequal length phases, it starts to become not only less realistic, but also pretty counterproductive when we think about the fact that consistency is key when we actually want adaptations of any kind. So if we are going to stop lifting weights for 3 weeks due to some theoretical hormone advantage, I just don't see how that could possibly be better than just consistent training.
Yeah, I guess the way that I would envisage that be tested in like a randomized controlled trial would be to take a big group of women and randomize them. One group is just doing the same type of resistance training exercise program throughout the entire month, and maybe this goes for like 3 months. The other group is given this prescription to adjust during the follicular phase and post-ovulatory phase, and somehow they're individualizing that based on their own cycle, and then you're comparing these outcomes, over that 10 to 12 week period of group A, who is not changing their training based on their cycle, and group B, who is changing it based on the type of information that people are getting online today.
That's one way. You could also try to do it within the subject and have them do one leg and one arm and then the other leg and the other arm. There are arguments why one or the other is better, because we want to try to reduce the variability as much as possible. But then you could say, well, that's not really an ecologically valid way to train if you're just doing, leg extensions and bicep curls or something like that. But the effect would have to be so incredibly powerful that this few days of elevated estradiol is going to be so anabolic that it would be better to do this tweaked training that is overall less total volume. It's hard to think of a scenario where that really pans out.
The key takeaway from your study being that muscle protein synthesis post training, which is affected by the resistance training, but also by protein utilization, right, did not appear to be different depending on whether a woman was performing that during the pre-ovulatory phase or post-ovulatory phase.
That's right. There are two ways to measure protein synthesis. So one way is acutely over a period of hours. And so typically you're hooked up to an IV and you can exercise during this time. So you might have a baseline biopsy at rest, and then you would infuse a tracer and then exercise and then take another biopsy and then kind of compare that, or maybe several biopsies depending on the design. That's one way. The way that is preferable, because it actually accounts for everything else you do, is to use the deuterium tracers, because that allows you to measure it over a much longer period. So what we did was a 6-day period where we take a baseline biopsy and then we're exercising, and then they're coming back 2 days later and we're exercising, and then they're coming back. And so we're looking at not only the effect of the exercise, but also, the effect of just going about your day, physical activity, sleep, nutrition, everything that goes in. So in that way, it's kind of more representative of real life. And we're also able to say, okay, so this is accumulation over the 6-day period integrated into the muscle of the tracer. And so it makes it more powerful than saying over a 4-hour period, this is what happened.
Is this the first study that has shown this, and have any other labs, I guess, since that study replicated that?
No, there are some older studies, but this particular methodology has not been replicated.
Okay. And based on those findings, as we know them today, if you were to simplify this message to the woman listening now, what does this mean for her training?
Nothing. I think we actually don't know when we are ovulating or when our hormones are fluctuating. What we do know is when we are menstruating, when we are bleeding. We also know when we feel menstrual symptoms. And so for some people, that's right before you start bleeding. For some people, that's day 1 or day 2. Those are the typical times that most people are going to get menstrual cramps or bloating or fatigue. But interestingly, I hear some women say, I always get a PR on the first day of my period. And I hear other women say, I can't even go to the gym on the first day of my period. So the lived experience and the presence and severity of these symptoms are also very variable. So I think the takeaway is be mindful if you are experiencing symptoms that you can adjust your training that day or skip the gym that day. And we should all have an element of autoregulation in our program that allows us to do that. And that's not only true for menstrual symptoms, it can be true for a whole host of other reasons as well.
And is that the best way for the individual to adjust their program, thinking about the subjective feelings, or are there other objective markers that you're aware of in the literature that also provide insight into how the body's recovering and how prepared the body is for, say, strength training or high-intensity cardio training?
Around the menstrual cycle or in general?
No, just if we push the menstrual cycle to the side,
yeah,
and we're saying, okay, look, the data suggests that probably shouldn't be tweaking and adjusting our training program based on the menstrual cycle. The evidence is not there, despite some mechanistic data that people may have used. So we're not using that. Other than just subjective feeling, I wake up feeling tired, I wake up feeling a bit sore. Are there any objective markers that a woman can use to modulate her training?
Not that I would recommend broadly, because I think we're in an era of the wearables where it's starting to take away our agency. And so we're saying, well, let me look at the app to tell me how I slept, and therefore to tell me whether I should train hard today or not. And it's, sometimes that data is interesting, but if we aren't able to have that autonomy to say, hey, I feel like training hard today, I think that's important. And we also have to say, who are we speaking about? Is this an elite athlete who wants an abundance of data, and maybe they will or won't do anything with it, but it's nice to have and it's important to track and we have the means to collect it all? That's one scenario. But if we're going to speak broadly to women, I'm not going to say, yes, we have a robust data set that HRV is really, really useful.
At what point do we give too much power to our subjective feelings, though? Because, I know myself, a lot of days I don't really want to work out. And I will myself in there and I do it. And there are many times where I surprise myself where I thought, wow, I'm low energy. I get in there after a warm up, 5 to 10 minutes. I'm into it. I have a great workout. I feel incredible. But if I had have just relied on my subjective feeling while I was on the couch, I wouldn't have gone and done that workout.
I completely agree. And so I think we can definitely take the whole listen to your body thing too far, such that we end up not doing much. I think when we look at survey data too, it's interesting because you see, on average, the majority of women, let's say over 70%, experience menstrual symptoms, and the majority of them do not change their training at all. So that's what's happening in real life and in real active women. They're not changing anything, which frankly, it makes sense because they're also going about their day and going to work and picking up their kids and doing all the other things that they need to do when they have menstrual symptoms and when they don't. So it doesn't shock me that most people are training anyway. I think we do that, as you said, on days when we didn't sleep well, but we just make it happen. And not every workout has to be an A+, and that's fine. So I want to acknowledge that people have menstrual symptoms, but I don't think we need to be treating it any differently than we would if we just weren't feeling well for another reason. I would either work out anyway or back off the intensity or switch up the exercises or, do whatever it is that I'm going to do to kind of make a workout happen. Or, if it's very severe and you just can't train that day, then that's fine. It's only one workout. It's not a big deal. 10, 15 years ago, people got really excited about fasted training because they were doing these acute measures and saying, oh, I'm oxidizing more fat. I'm using more fat as fuel. So shouldn't this translate to long-term fat loss over time? And all the bodybuilders started doing fasted cardio thinking, this is going to help me lose fat for my bodybuilding prep. And it doesn't work that way.
We've now got the Pod 5 Ultra from 8 Sleep set up on our spare bed at home, and without fail, every guest who stays ends up hooked by the time that they leave. Reflecting on our friend Coco's recent stay, it reminded me just how much the temperature of your environment shapes your sleep. Sure, the air in the room matters, but so does the temperature of the mattress that you're in direct contact with for 7 to 9 hours every night. That's what I love about the Pod 5 Ultra. It's a high-tech cover that fits over your existing bed and uses precision temperature control to keep your body in its ideal sleep zone. It actually learns your sleep patterns through built-in sensors and automatically adjusts through what they call autopilot, so you stay at the perfect temperature all night. The result? Clinical studies show it can give you up to an hour more quality sleep each night, cut snoring in half, and boost next day energy by over 30%. So if you want to feel more rested and perform better during the day, head to 8sleep.com/theproof and use the code THEPROOF to get up to $700 off your very own Pod 5 Ultra. That's 8sleep.com/theproof and use the code THEPROOF for a gigantic saving of up to $700. You'll get 30 days to try it at home and return it if you don't love it, though I'm almost certain you will not send it back. Trust me, your body will thank you for this investment in better sleep. Talk to me about the importance or lack of importance when it comes to fasted exercise, fasted cardio versus fed cardio. And are there any biological sex differences that would make fasted cardio more or less suitable for a woman?
This seems to have come out of nowhere, frankly, this messaging, because we have data in women. We have data from 2013 and 2014 testing this in women where they were training fed or training fasted and body composition changes were similar. Paper came out, I forget if it was I think it was earlier this year, where they were doing resistance training fed or fasted over a 12-week period, and there were no differences in muscle growth or strength gains over time. So it comes down to, from my perspective, just practically speaking, is personal preference. Some people feel better eating before they train. Other people experience GI issues if they eat too close to a workout. And if you're somebody who gets up to train really early in the morning, then maybe you don't eat, and that's okay. Or you might experiment with both and find that one works better for you or not. But I think the circumstances under which the fueling pre-workout are going to be important is if you're doing very long endurance training, or maybe you're doing 2 workouts a day, or we're focused on a particular performance metric that we know we perform better with some fuel. So it's not to say that fueling couldn't help under certain circumstances, but to make the blanket statement that you shouldn't or you should be doing one or the other because of your sex, we don't have the data.
I think the claim that I've seen, and where I think this confuses women, is that there is an idea out there that's being pushed that if a woman specifically trains in a fasted state, that this is kind of no bueno for her metabolism, and it's going to damage her insulin sensitivity, it's going to damage her appetite, and it's going to lead to her having increased body fat levels, right? So my question is, that study that you looked at that compared a fasted exercise and to fed exercise, and then was looking at muscle mass and I think body fat, were they looking at body composition as well?
Yeah. So we have 3 that right. fall under that category.
If you take woman A and woman B, and woman A is doing fasted exercise, be it strength training or cardio, woman B is eating before that exercise, but across the 24-hour period, both woman A and woman B are consuming like the same relative number of calories and protein. What you're saying is there's no difference for the outcomes that we care about, being muscle mass and body fat.
Correct. And this is where we have to be careful about any kind of acute measure. So 10, 15 years ago, people got really excited about fasted training because they were doing these acute measures and saying, oh, I'm oxidizing more fat. I'm using more fat as fuel. So shouldn't this translate to long-term fat loss over time? And all the bodybuilders started doing fasted cardio thinking, this is going to help me lose fat for my bodybuilding prep. And it doesn't work that way, because just because you are oxidizing more fat during that workout, or even during the hour post-workout, depending on the type of exercise we're talking about, it doesn't translate into long-term fat loss. Because when we think about long-term fat loss, then we need to think about the overall calories consumed and energy expended over time. And so we need to be really cautious about making any of these extrapolations based on not only that mechanistic data or the animal data, but also those acute measures.
So to put this one to bed, it's not true that fasted exercise leads to greater fat storage or to an increased appetite that would then drive higher energy intake over the day.
It's not true.
And so what is your take-home advice here to a woman who's trying to work out whether she should fuel and with what before a morning workout?
I think you should exercise regardless. So if you're someone who prefers to eat and you have time to eat, then eat. If you're somebody who doesn't feel very well, if you eat right before the gym, then eat afterwards. That's completely fine. I think this narrative is sort of assuming that, we wake up in the morning and we're just on empty. Like, we didn't eat the day before. We have no stored glycogen. We have nothing to fuel this workout. I mean, that's just not true. So for the average person doing your 30, 45 hour long workout at the gym, it doesn't matter. You can do whatever you prefer. And that's great because we have more options.
Shifting gears to another, area of physiology where people will point to and say, there's a clear sex difference here, and this should affect how women train versus men. And that, I mentioned it earlier, that is muscle fibers. Is it true that women generally have more type 1, so slow twitch, slow to fatigue muscle fibers, and fewer type 2, this fast twitch, fast to fatigue muscle fiber, relative to men?
Maybe. There's some data to support that claim, but it's single biopsy measures always from the vastus lateralis, so always from your thigh. So can we say that it's true for all of the muscles in the body? No. When we look at the differences that are reported, they're fairly small. So it's not like women have 70% type 1. We're talking about the difference between, maybe it's 45, 55 or something like that, and as a split. But importantly, we know that muscle fiber transitions occur due to training. So if we look at muscle fiber type in an elite marathon runner, they are going to have more type 1 fibers because that is a training specific adaptations. If we look at a elite Olympic weightlifter, they are going to have the opposite. And so it's not good or bad. And it's not like we need to be striving to correct it one way or the other, because these are two examples of people who are really elite in their sport, but they're different sports. And so the muscle adaptations we get from the training we do, and there's probably a genetic component as well. Who knows? Was it that they are elite because they were born with fiber type distribution that propelled them to be better in the sport, or were there fiber type transition that occurs as a function of this type of training? Maybe it's both. We don't know. But the point being, the argument I hear is, since there is this discrepancy, we should be doing a type of exercise to try to correct it or try to bring it back so that it's half and half. And there's no rationale for doing that. It's not like if you were 50-50, you are a healthier person or you will live longer. What we know is that these dictate performance, and the transitions are occurring due to how we train.
But outside of performance, is there any merit to the idea that type 2 muscle fibers, so these fast twitch, are particularly important for the speed at which you can kind of produce force and generate force and power, and that being important in the context of longevity and reducing risk of falls. I think that's where I've seen this come up most, is that, okay, as we age, and this is my understanding, and feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, but men and women, all of us, as we age, we get a kind of shifting of less type 2 muscle fibers, fast twitch, and more relative type 1 slow twitch. And it affects our ability to generate force quickly, which could be important in terms of like reaction time and catching yourself in a fall. Is that accurate? That happens broadly for men and women? And if so, is that just a case for everyone as they're aging, doing strength and high intensity training to stimulate those type 2 fibers?
Yeah, so we know that we lose muscle mass, muscle strength, and muscle power with age. Is it due specifically to changes in fiber type? No, we don't have that. We know that we're being too sedentary, or maybe we get sick. And when we look at the fiber types in people who are ill or sedentary, they actually have a lot of hybrid fibers. They're not these pure fibers. And so that's the outcome that you get when you have it, you're in a disease state or you're extremely sedentary. So yes, we need to all be doing strength training for a variety of reasons. We don't want to lose muscle. We don't want to lose strength. We don't want to lose power. All of those are going to contribute to our long-term physical function. And if we are able to incorporate some balance exercises into our training, let's say you're doing a walking lunge, then that's also going to help with fall prevention. And, if we don't fall, we don't fracture. That's important for bone. So I think your take-home message about what's important is spot on. The why behind the what is interesting, and I would say we don't have all of that information. I mean, frankly, we don't even have all the information about why we're losing muscle, period. We can say, how much of it is age, how much of it is inactivity, how much of it is a combination of both. What we know, or anabolic resistance, but what we know is what you can do about it. And so I think it's really important for people to hear that this is the way that we address it, and this works no matter how late in life you start. Even if you're someone who's never lifted weights and you're 75, you can still reap the benefits of training.
That brings me back to, I guess, how I feel about some of Dr. Stacey Sims' recommendations. Because I think her recommendations for strength training for women of all ages and high intensity training, I think they are directionally right, even if some of her reasoning isn't. And that's not to say that we shouldn't be clarifying the reasoning and talking about the why, because I think it's important, as we discussed at the start of this episode. But the point that I kind of want to underscore here is, despite some discrepancy in terms of how we're thinking about this and what the evidence is showing, a lot of the recommendations are overlapping.
Yes and no, because her argument, as far as I understand, is that due to these fiber type differences, all women over a certain age, 30, 40, or menopause, should be only doing high load, low rep training. So that affects the practical recommendation. And we have an abundance of data in people of all ages at this point doing high, moderate, and low reps. And we know that if you train close enough to failure, you're getting similar results. And this is something that our understanding has shifted. If you took a personal trainer course 20 years ago, you learned about this strength endurance continuum. And if you want to get stronger, then you're doing the high load, low reps. If you want muscle growth, you're doing an 8 to 12. And then anything beyond that is just muscular endurance, and you're not getting any hypertrophy. So our understanding of that after a lot of research now is you can do whatever you want as long as you're training close enough to failure, which I think is a really important message, especially for people who are in midlife or later in life who are newer to training. If we can give you options, then that lowers the barrier to entry.
Yeah, totally. Some people don't have the equipment in order to do low rep, or as you say, maybe not the skill to do it in a way that's safe. That said, and I've kind of been going through this with my mum, and she won't mind me sharing this, she loves doing her exercise and she has osteopenia, strong family history of it on my mum's side. And I think there is an argument for, even though we have those studies showing that you can still promote hypertrophy, muscle growth with very high reps with a low load, I don't think that is as advantageous from a bone density point of view. Do you have any comments on that?
We don't know conclusively. And the reason for that is because we have a far less robust body of literature in bone, because bone adaptations take so much longer than muscle adaptations. And getting people to stick with the study for a year and getting the funding to carry that out is tough. People who say that you need to be lifting really heavy for bone often point to the Lift More trial. And this was a study where one group of women did heavy barbell deadlifts, back squats, and overhead press, I believe, and these hard landing jumps. So they were jumping up to a pull-up bar and then trying to land as hard as possible, keeping their legs as straight as possible. So that's protocol for one group. The other group did this at-home body weight exercise program that wasn't designed to elicit any bone adaptations, by the author's own admission. So this is an example where of course, the group that was doing the heavy lifting and the jumping had a better outcome than the group that was doing this largely ineffective program. What it doesn't tell us is, what if there was a group that was doing, a set of 8 to 12? It also doesn't tell us to what extent was it the lifting and to what extent was it the hard landing jumps. So there are a lot of questions that need to be kind of teased out there. And when we look at meta-analyses for bone, there are some studies showing that moderate loads were better than high or low. There are some studies showing that low was effective. And there are some studies showing that jumping was effective and others showing that it wasn't. And so I think we are not really at a place where we can conclusively and confidently give really strict guidelines about lifting and rep ranges and or the inclusion of jumping. But we do know that the lifting weights is helpful, and people will also encourage some form of kind of balance training for fall prevention. And I think with jumping, there are a lot of women who are really averse to jumping, and certainly this hard landing jump with your legs as straight as possible is not an exercise that I would typically recommend nor do myself. So we need to be a bit careful before we translate that research too practically.
How would you approach this if you were 65 and wanting to improve your bone mineral density?
Well, the unfortunate truth is that through exercise, we probably aren't improving our bone density anymore at that age, because bone mass is peaking in our 20s. So we're really trying to hold on to what we have as opposed to try to gain more. And that makes bone adaptations distinct from muscle adaptations. But certainly we have really powerful anti-osteoporotic medications that are available that are very effective for women if they're appropriate. There are also, in some cases, benefits of estrogen-based therapy on bone. From an exercise standpoint, we want everybody lifting weights for muscle. So if we are saying, well, we're going to do that anyway, and we know there are some added benefits for bone, it's a no-brainer for me to recommend that. And then I think we want to encourage overall physical activity, and we want to encourage moving in different planes of motion through different ranges of motion. If you're somebody who is physically active and can do deep squats and lunges, then walking up the stairs isn't going to be a problem for you. And if you are more agile, you're going to be able to catch yourself before you fall. So kind of practically speaking, I think it would be unfortunate if we found out that, oh, we need actually this whole new, completely different regimen just for bone. Because then we're saying, all right, you need to do resistance training for muscle, and then you need to do this new other program for bone, and then we want to do our cardiovascular exercise as well. And so then we're making it harder for people to kind of hit all those targets. But I think we'll learn more in the coming years about exercise adaptations for bone. We just need to be patient because, like I said, you need to do a 9-month, 12-month study in order to get some quality data. Otherwise, you wouldn't expect to see any changes.
Yeah. And I should clarify, when I was referring to my mum and her exercise, I would classify what she's doing as more of a moderate load, not heavy load. So it is more in that 8 to 12 kind of rep range. And at least my kind of rationale for that rep range was that it's enough to get those hypertrophy adaptations, but also might be better for bone than doing like reps of 30 sets of 30. We don't, maybe we don't know. But the rationale was that lower reps with a higher load could increase her risk of injury. Is there any evidence that would support that you're more injury prone if you're lifting a load that allows you to lift kind of 3 or 4 reps and you're at failure?
I think I would never prescribe that to somebody who's new, because think about it, if your deadlift form is just a little bit off, and you might be more likely for that to be a little bit off, and you're lifting those really heavy loads. So in that sense, yeah, I think it is a bit riskier. The other reason not to recommend that rep range for somebody who's new is we want to practice the movements. We want to get the way we develop good technique is by practicing the movement patterns, and also understanding, what is close to failure. What does it mean to feel like, okay, I know I only have 1 left in the tank? And so that's why the rep range that you mentioned, the 8 to 12, really would be my go-to for the majority of people. I think it allows for enough repetition that you're practicing and really focusing on form and getting used to the movement, and also it's allowing you to get close enough to failure or to feel what it's like to get close enough to failure. And it's appropriate for the majority of exercises. Nobody wants to do a set of 30 barbell squats.
Yeah, your workout would be like 2+ hours.
There is no creatine for women. It's all just creatine monohydrate. So if they put it in a pink bottle and charged you double, you've been scammed. Get the regular creatine.
I recently ran my full labs through Function Health, and I have to say the results were eye-opening. Turns out my ApoB was higher than ideal, probably thanks to a little too much coconut yogurt. I also found out I was slightly low in copper, something that I would have never suspected without testing. On the flip side, my biological age came back 13.3 years younger than my actual age, a calculation based on the work of aging researcher Dr. Morgan Levine. So all in all, I've got a few tweaks to make to optimize my lipids and nutrient status, but overall my blood work says I'm doing pretty well. That's what I love about Function. You get access to over 160 biomarkers covering everything from hormones and inflammation to nutrients, toxins, cardiovascular risk, and more. And all your results are housed in one beautiful platform, all tracked over time. Once you get your results, you can make informed changes before small issues become big ones. To get started, head to functionhealth.com/Simon Hill. The first 1,000 people get a $100 credit toward their membership. That's functionhealth.com/Simon Hill. Zone 2 training. The other claim that I've come across is that some people argue that this long steady state cardio for women in particular can chronically raise cortisol. And it sounds very scary. And the idea there being that if cortisol has been chronically increased by going out and doing a 45-minute just steady state jog or cycle on a bike, that this is impairing recovery, it's limiting your ability to sleep properly, and it's affecting fat distribution. what does the research actually show here? And should women of any age be scared of steady state cardio?
They should not. And we should not discourage any form of physical activity. I really don't like any kind of messaging that does, because you have women who have been running their whole lives and love it. And now they're saying, oh, should I stop? My friends are telling me I shouldn't run anymore, or I shouldn't cycle anymore. And I don't like any kind of messaging that is discouraging people from doing exercise they enjoy, because that's one of the most powerful things we can do for our health. This cortisol narrative has really taken the internet by storm, when in reality, all exercise acutely increases cortisol, and that's normal. That's supposed to happen. And the idea that it's going to increase fat accumulation is sort of borrowed from Cushing's syndrome, where you actually do have chronically elevated cortisol, and you can have some body fat redistribution or some weight gain in your face or some water retention. And so that has spiraled into cortisol face and cortisol belly, and we need to be avoiding a certain type of exercise, or you need supplements or something cortisol related. And this narrative just isn't true, because in healthy folks, our cortisol is really well regulated, and it increases when it's supposed to, and it comes back down when it's supposed to, and it's not something that we need to think about. And just because chronically elevated cortisol in a disease state is problematic doesn't mean that normal acute changes during exercise are problematic. High blood pressure is not good, but blood pressure increases during exercise, and that's fine. So, we have to put all of these in context. And unfortunately, the way they're packaged these days makes it very fear-based and, frankly, not at all evidence-based.
So do you think most men and women, and let's say we're talking to someone who's generally interested in aging well and reducing their risk of chronic disease, so we're not necessarily talking about an athlete here and their program, do you think that most men and women should have some form of moderate kind of steady state intensity cardio and high intensity cardio, or how do you think about that?
I think for the average person, they should do what they will do and what they prefer to do, because I think it's pretty unrealistic to expect people you think about how many people are actually exercising at all. It's nowhere near enough. So if we then say, and now you need to lift weights and do HIIT and do steady state, most people are not going to do that for long enough, consistently enough, that it actually will affect their long-term health. So I come back to physical activity is really important. Let's encourage people to do whatever form of physical activity they will do consistently. And if they prefer HIIT because it's more time efficient, then great. But it's not better than doing Zone 2. They're different. They're equally beneficial for your health, but so is a recreational hike with friends or bike or kayak. And so if you're going to do that and you absolutely hate the kind of structured quote cardio exercise, then that's fine too. I think we need to be less stringent with the rules around this type of exercise.
Yeah, I know personally, I find running, particularly like running on the treadmill, far less enjoyable than going and playing. I've been playing padel. It's like a sort of mini form of tennis. And that kind of, for me, bringing in the fun and the social element, it makes that cardio, it makes it go by really quickly, and it makes it super enjoyable. And I'm always looking forward to going back and doing it. So I totally agree. Find something that you actually look forward to doing in some, to some degree. If we move now to zoom in a little bit more on, let's say, perimenopause and menopause, are there any kind of major physiological changes that occur during peri and post menopause that are known to affect training, recovery, and nutrition in a way that would result in someone changing their approach to exercise or nutrition through that period?
Should they or do they?
Should they? Is there evidence to suggest that the physiology is changing through peri and post-menopause, and because of that, we should adapt the way that we train, or we should adapt the way we fuel around our training.
No, not at all. What we do know is the lived experience of each menopause transition is going to be very different. The length of it is different. Some people have terrible symptoms. Some people do not at all. Some people have symptoms that come and go. Some people benefit a lot from menopause hormone therapy and others don't find a benefit. And so a lot of this transition period is trying to address symptoms if they are present and acknowledging the downstream effects of those symptoms. So for example, if you have night sweats or hot flashes, or your sleep is incredibly disrupted, then that probably will affect your ongoing motivation to go to the gym, perhaps your adherence to your diet, things like that. So from a practical perspective, I think we do need to acknowledge the potential effect of symptoms on people engaging in their kind of habitual activities. And there's also just a kind of perfect storm of inadvertent life changes that can happen. Maybe your kids went to university and now you're an empty nester, or you retired recently and you're inadvertently changing your habitual physical activity patterns or your nutritional habits, and that can contribute to gains in body fat over this period. And it's not menopause in and of itself. It's a contribution of all of these things that are related to aging, this period of life, the downstream effects of these symptoms.
Can you explain to everyone what anabolic resistance is, and how much of that is driven by age and lifestyle versus sex differences?
I don't think we have a great answer to that because we don't truly understand even just the relative contribution of aging versus anabolic resistance. What we know is the muscle of an older person appears to be less sensitive to, an individual dose of dietary protein, and less sensitive to the training stimulus, meaning, the adaptations that you would get at 25 are not the same as the adaptations that you would get at 65 on average, right? So we don't fully understand why, because there are these factors that we can't separate. And so when we talk about aging, there are so many elements that go along with aging, so you can't separate them out from aging. And so it's the same when we think about the menopause transition. It's very easy to say, oh, that's menopause, when in reality it's aging. And one thing we can do is to look at the trajectory of men versus women. We then also need to consider the lifestyle factors. And so much of that longer term data that we have is not in active older people. It's in inactive older people.
Right. So the decreased response to exercise and to protein at age 65 that we see in the data, the question is that from living a sedentary lifestyle? And if so, is it possible that if you're active earlier in life through your 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s, you can really attenuate that? I'm surprised that no one's gone out and looked at an active population and compared their responsiveness to exercise and protein to a sedentary population of 65-year-olds.
Well, there aren't a ton of really active 65 and 70-year-olds. So it's more difficult to recruit that kind of population. There are some masters athletes studies that you can look to, and it certainly shows that you can be extremely fit and extremely strong in your older age if you continue to exercise. I fully agree with you that I would hypothesize if you start training earlier in life, then you are much likely to fare better as we age. But right now, when people will quote things like you lose this percent of muscle per year after age 30 or after age 40, you're really modeling, a cohort of 20-year-olds and a cohort of 30-year-olds and a cohort of 70-year-olds. And then you're kind of modeling that. You're not comparing these people to themselves. You're not tracking them over their full adult life. And again, it doesn't take into account, were you lifting weights? What was your diet? So I think we should be less terrified about age-related muscle loss if we are continuing to be physically active and doing some resistance training.
On protein, I saw that you were one of the authors on a meta-analysis of protein intake to support muscle mass and function in healthy adults. Can you share with us what were the key takeaways of that, and how much protein would you say appears optimal for body composition and strength in adults that are over 65?
The key takeaway is that if you're not lifting weights, then increasing your protein to a much higher intake is probably not going to do much for you. I think we do see a benefit going from the 0.8 grams per kilogram to the 1.2, 1.3 grams per kilogram. I think we can safely say that that's probably something everybody should do. But beyond that, the idea that we're going to eat our way to gains is just sort of a misunderstanding of how it works. We need the resistance training as the stimulus, and then we optimize that stimulus with dietary protein.
And is that the same for women and men, all adults under 65?
It is. I mean, we have some more recent data because we talk about it in terms of body weight, but if you really think about it, we should be scaling it to how much muscle you have if we're saying, well, we want to shuttle these amino acids into the muscle. So that said, a less muscular person probably doesn't need quite as much protein. There are going to be some sex differences there. But given that we don't have a wide ability to measure that ourselves, I think it's probably easier to stick with these numbers based on body weight. And if you're getting, technically a bit more protein than your amount of muscle mass can benefit from, there's no downside.
And how do you feel about some of the recommendations, I guess, that are popular online now from some people who are suggesting to consume kind of 2 grams per kilogram per day, particularly for women?
I think it's very high. There's nothing wrong with it if you enjoy it, but we need to set goals and targets that are more realistic for the majority of people. And that level of protein intake, especially for somebody who's currently eating 0.8 or lower, that's not a realistic jump. And we don't have data that it's actually beneficial. So maybe if you go that high, you could say, well, I really like a high protein diet because it helps me with satiety. And so it helps me adhere to my fat loss diet. Okay, I can see an argument for that. Or maybe you just love eating protein, fine. But if we say there's a real benefit, a noticeable shift, where do we start to kind of see that drop off? It's probably 1.6, and then we're not seeing much beyond that.
And I think if you target 1.6 grams per kilogram, if you were to kind of work that out on your individual basis, I think a lot of people would end up probably hitting 1.2, 1.3 grams because of how difficult it is. And, I know myself, there are days if I'm not focusing on this, I fall well short of 1.6 grams per kilogram.
I also think most people aren't tracking their protein, and if they are, they aren't doing a great job. And even if they're doing the best job they could possibly do, there's just inherent error. And so it's sort of a waste of time to be battling about, is it 1.5 or 1.7 when frankly it could be either, even if you are really, really trying to nail one number or the other.
But takeaway being 1.2 to 1.3 grams per kilogram seems to be better than the 0.8 grams per kilogram. And so a good idea if you can get at least up to that level.
Yes, which for most people is going to look like eating a good portion of protein with every meal, and then maybe adding a high protein snack or shake.
Are there any supplements that you would say have credible evidence for improving recovery or any adaptations from training, specifically in women more so than men?
No, not that come to mind. I think supplements for recovery, the evidence is really weak because it's hard to measure recovery. And when we look at recovery modalities, not only in supplements, in all forms, you get some people who seem to have a subjective feeling of recovery, which is great, right? I mean, foam rolling is a great example of that. There's no objective data to show that foam rolling actually does anything, but if it helps you feel better, then sure, do it. From a supplement perspective, people have been hopeful over the years about various things, and I will hear anecdotally people say this helped me or that helped me, but I don't think we can broadly recommend a supplement for recovery.
There's this idea floating around that women benefit more from creatine than men. Can you clear that up? Is that true?
Yeah, it's funny because creatine has been around forever and it's sort of having a renaissance because it's being repackaged and marketed to women. So I'd like to just point out that there is no creatine for women. It's all just creatine monohydrate. So if they put it in a pink bottle and charged you double, you've been scammed. Get the regular creatine. I think if you're lifting weights and you're looking for that extra rep or the extra half second on your sprint, then creatine is probably worth taking. Women don't benefit more. It comes from a misunderstanding about creatine synthesis, meaning the creatine that we are synthesizing endogenously versus the creatine that is stored in the muscle. So if we think about all of our skeletal muscle, 95% of creatine, maybe a bit more, is stored in skeletal muscle. So if that's our bucket, then we have a cap at which to fill with our creatine stores. So the larger the bucket, the more muscle you have, then the longer you have to go. And so that means a more muscular person likely benefits more from creatine supplementation because maybe their bucket's only halfway full. And so they have that much more to benefit in order to saturate the muscle cells with creatine. But so when we think about the average woman, she has less overall muscle mass. And so that's why when we look at the data, creatine doesn't seem to be quite as beneficial for women, particularly older women. And the likely explanation for that is because of the lower muscle mass. So you're not actually getting, once it's saturated, it's saturated.
How do you think about dosing creatine? And is creatine something that you take personally?
I do take it personally. I've gone in phases of life taking it and not taking it, and I frankly don't notice a difference whether I'm taking it or not. But I lift weights, and creatine is cheap, and creatine is safe. So I take 5 grams per day. I know there's a lot of hype right now about 10 grams or plus for the cognitive function conversation, but we need to be pretty careful about that because right now, although the data is exciting and promising, it's in populations with some sort of deficit. So if you are diagnosed with clinical depression, you have traumatic brain injury, Alzheimer's, there's a deficit there. And so just like with muscle, when we talk about, like filling the bucket, if the bucket from the brain context is already full, then you're not going to further benefit. You're not getting some sort of cognitive boost. So I think although supplementation looks promising in these trials, in these populations, we have to be careful about translating it to say everyone should be taking it, for cognitive function. And people can have some GI issues when you start to take higher doses of creatine. So that's just something to keep in mind.
Do you think that people taking it for muscle adaptations primarily, they should calculate the amount that's right for them based on how much they weigh? So I've seen in some of the trials, like 5 grams is used. In other trials, they sort of standardize it doing 0.1 grams per kilogram, which is kind of makes more sense to me because, I weigh probably much more than you. And so presumably the dose of creatine that I need per day to saturate my muscle cells is more.
Yeah, I think that 5 grams is probably too high for me. I haven't done that calculation. I mean, again, you'd actually want to do it for muscle mass, not for body weight, if you were trying to be exact. So, but given that if I'm taking a little bit too much, all I'm doing is wasting a little bit of money. I don't think it's probably necessary to get that granular, but certainly there's an argument for doing that. And in the context of a trial, if you want to standardize it, then that makes sense to me as well, because you're saying if somebody is technically getting a higher dose relative to the other people in the group, then that is technically a confounding variable. But if you think about just what are we recommending to the public? Do we need to get that granular? I don't think so.
To kind of close this out, Lauren, if you could rewrite the general exercise guidelines today, would you change anything? And would there be anything in there that would be specific for women?
I think we miss the element of progressive overload in the general exercise guidelines. That's never explained well to people. And women often miss the mark on that, meaning I'm just from personal experience coaching people. I know women tend to underestimate themselves and the amount of weight that they can lift and what they can do. And so I think we need to be clearer about what is a challenging load, and then how do we progress over time, and what is proximity to failure. And we need to try to articulate these things to the public in a way that is clear and that's helpful. But as far as sex-specific recommendations, no. My recommendations would be physical activity, do what you enjoy, do it consistently, do it sustainably, do it week in and week out and month out for the long term, and lift weights. Do it at least twice a week. We see benefits from even just 2 20, 30-minute workouts per week.
Great. And folks can jump back. I had a great conversation with Dr. Alyssa Olenek on progressive overload previously, so you can go back and find that conversation. Lastly here, Lauren, where would you like to see this conversation around female-specific training on social media and in the mainstream media go from here as we sit in 2025?
I'd like women to just employ effective training strategies, because my whole life I've been, as a woman, I think, given really terrible fitness advice, from group fitness classes to tiny dumbbells to stay out of the weight room. That was certainly when I was in high school, there were no girls in the weight room at all. And we were discouraged from lifting weights, and everyone's telling you you're going to get bulky. And so it's interesting that we're now in this new wave of a different type of misinformation, but it's still aimed at women. And the end result is that they still aren't doing effective training. So whether that's you're doing the cycle syncing and kind of spinning your wheels, or you're trying to do exercise in a type of rep range that you hate or don't feel comfortable doing, and so then you're not going to the gym consistently, or you're following this group fitness trend and then you're switching it up in a month. This is all kind of holding women back from maximizing their potential, optimizing their health, because we need to do whatever the thing is for a long term in order to actually see results. So I would like exercise recommendations to just be goal oriented. It's really not about your sex or your age. It's about the goal, and we need the appropriate recommendation for you to reach that goal.
Beautiful. Well, thank you very much for hanging out with me and all of our listeners today and clarifying several important issues. Really appreciate all the work you're doing.
Thank you.
There you have it, friends. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you did and want to stay up to date with future episodes, be sure to hit that subscribe button on YouTube and follow on Apple or Spotify. Finally, thank you for showing up and the effort that you're making to take control of your health. I look forward to hanging out with you again in the next episode.